been doing Ecologic?
Gosh, I don't know. At least 20.
Oh, wow.
At least 20.
So that's a good historical number to use too.
And it's the Boy Scouts are really the sponsor. The Boy Scouts are Troop 405, and one of my Eagle Scouts is directing and running all the equipment and cameras and so forth tonight. So it started off as a way that we could deal with the merit badge that involves cinematography. And so if a scout wants to produce a program in the Evangelary Council, we would welcome their input and welcome that to dream up and design a program that we would have him kind of direct it and work with our own scouts and make it happen. So I-49, this project's been around a long time. I guess it really cranked up 93, 94, so it's been around for 23, 24 years. Lawsuits have been filed over it. Presently there's lawsuits over it. So share with us some of your thoughts, Mike.
Well, there are a lot of aspects to I-49. The EIS is, as you said, quite old, and I've tried to look through it. It's very long. It's about 400 pages, I believe. I was surprised to find how little there really is in the EIS.
It's very long on generalizations. You know, we handle flood water by saying that it'll go to the bayou. Well, yeah, I mean, but does putting concrete over hundreds of acres, waterproofing this, does it raise the level of the bayou? And it's something that you have to deal with. I mean, this community has realized that all the parking lots we put up, we have to have retention ponds. Well, the bayou is the runoff of the bayou goes much quicker, rises the bayou much quicker and faster, and instead of, you know, your house might be flooded just for an hour, but when it's flooded an hour, that's as good as 100 days.
Yes, and you would have expected, I would have expected when I first read the EIS that there'd be analysis in there, at least at the level of an undergraduate hydrology course, making a calculation of the extra runoff that would come in due to the project.
And this plan had no retention ponds, whatever.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't address it at all. It's the plan gets its bulk from telling us about how big the watershed is and what the soils are like, and many facts that just seem to be facts that they found and filled in the EIS. So I was disappointed that I didn't find more actual analysis in the EIS, actual engineering analysis.
And you would think that a hydrologist would have been consulted on that issue to deal with that, because you know, you have to designate acreage, space for these ponds, and it can be a source of beautification and so forth. They don't have to be ugly, but they have to be there.
Yeah, that's certainly true.
And that's ticklish for Lafayette, because Lafayette has had its share of flooding problems. In '93, I don't know, almost 2,000 homes went underwater.
Oh, a friend of mine lost his home.
And so the water didn't get, it got, 93, it got to about 16.3 at the Surrey Bridge. And that's not the high point. I think it was 1946, it got to 16.9. So it could have gotten a half a foot higher, which could have put a bunch of more homes, you know. And so flooding is very important to this community, and avoiding it is very important to this community. So to say we're going to build a big highway complex 5.5 miles long, you know, that's anywhere from 6 to 12 lanes wide at points, and all the underpasses and so forth that require pumps, and you know, it's got to go somewhere. It all goes to the bayou. So this is a very important environmental factor, you know, as well as the issue that the underpasses planned require pumps with completely independent backup generators for each, and that's on the city of Lafayette's nickel. So that's an ongoing expense to maintain and keep up. And then you have the problem with the plumbing from the underpasses to the bayou often fills up with leaves. So when the big flood comes, it doesn't drain properly because it's stopped up and nobody ever cleans these things up, as witnessed by the University and Jefferson underpasses, both of which have gone under twice in the last 6 weeks. So to say that we can handle it, you better put a big question mark on it. Lafayette can get a lot of rain very quickly, and you have to design for a certain, rain event, and say it's 6 inches in an hour. Well, if you get 8 inches in water in an hour, you overwhelm. Your system is overwhelmed, and the more generous you are with those design goals, the more expensive it is. And so some compromise has to be met there. So to say universally they'll never flood is probably nonsense, as witnessed the extensive flooding in Houston with the rain events we have. We just had in West Virginia. Nature is cruel, and we have to deal with it. So if you can avoid, in a very rain-prone area, if you can avoid underpasses and tunnels, probably a smart thing to do.
Yes, and it's going to get more important in the future. Sea level is rising. You can argue about what the causes are, but the number on the gauge keeps going up over the years, and in 50 years,
it's been rising for It's been rising for the last 10,000 years. So what was it? 10,000 years ago, the seas were 375 feet lower than they are now. The Gulf was 200 miles from here. So this is just the geologists can understand it very well because
it's been rising for a long time.
Now it might be rising a little quicker. That's a concern.
Yes, and it's going to almost certainly be rising for the next 50 years, and you need to plan out something big like an interstate highway. You need to be thinking 50 years in advance of what our great-grandchildren are going to be doing.
Right, and part of this, while we're talking about the flood issue, part of this project will require pushing the east-west runway to the east into the Cypress Island Swamp, which is a storage point for Lafayette's floodwater. The bayou backs up into that bowl between the Coteau Ridge, which the airport sits on and Lafayette sits on, and the Tesh Ridge. There's a 20,000 acre bowl there, and it's a swamp, and it's only an 8-foot elevation, and we would get a big rain event, and bayou goes north, and as long as it's going north, that bayou is rising. And it essentially, the only entry for filling that swamp is the bayou that will be impacted by pushing the runway back into that swamp. You either could put a bridge, and you got a real issue. The elevation of the Henderson levee is 31 feet, but it sits on ground that's about 12-foot elevation. So it's only about 19 feet high, if my math is right. Now, the runway is 48-foot elevation, and to continue it over the swamp is only 8-foot elevation. So it'll be a hill twice as high as the levees, and it's got to go out there about 1,200 feet by some estimates. So this can have an enormous impact if you use an earthen berm to do it, and you not only have to build the runway, you have to build the taxiway, and then you have to build the overrun basin, which they're in the process of building now. And so it's not just the extra 1,200 feet. You have the overrun basin, that's about 300 feet.
And then you have to have a road.
You have to have a road around it.
That goes around the end of the runway.
Maintain the lights and all that, absolutely. Yeah, and these are all FAA regulations. You're dealing with aircraft safety, which cannot and should not be compromised. So that's a tough issue, and I think the plan now for the Airport Commission is to do a separate environmental impact study on that item alone, which is really part of the I-49 connector and should not be broken out of an EIS. It's what they call piecemealing. Am I right on that?
Yes, legally, you're not allowed to piecemeal
An
an
EIS.
environmental impact statement.
Right, and that's been tested in court.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. I remember right, it might have been a Louisiana case. You know, where you wanted to
So-
build a 5-mile canal, so you put in 5 permits of a mile each.
Yes. And each one you say doesn't really cause
Really
much harm.
It doesn't hurt much harm because it's only a mile. Yeah, that's the whole point, right?
Yeah, So,
But, and then we have, right next to the airport is the old Lafayette landfill, which was in the 30s and early 40s. I can barely remember it operating, which was something they burned all the time, and they could dump any and everything. And the railroad used it as well as the community. So what's in there, nobody knows. And, you know, that's always a big concern for groundwater, these old landfills. If you're dealing with the threats to an aquifer, the first thing you want to do is identify and map those old landfills. Now, the university's Surrey interchange, some of the ramps will go right through that. So big question mark about how you handle that, how you drive pilings through a landfill.
yes,
You know,
and the plan
it
is. to
might be stopped by a Model T.
Well, the plan is to depress University below ground level in
Oh,
order
wow.
to keep the full height of the interchange lower.
Wow.
So University will be depressed and below ground level. So there could be problems going through that dump, and there could also be problems with seepage coming out of the dump into the embankments on
into
the
the
sides of
embankments,
the
yeah.
depressed University.
Yeah, yeah, no question about that. So, and then one of the big issues is the rail yard itself, which really started operating in 1875, but then went to a major operation of overhauling the trains in a roundhouse in 1882. And environmental concerns for chemicals was just not very great in 1882. And the process they used and began in 1882 essentially was carried all the way up to about 1960. Cleaning the trains, washing them, how they cleaned them, they repainted them, they fueled them, every train coming through. We had 10 trains a day, passenger trains that landed in Lafayette, 5 from New Orleans to Houston, and 5 vice versa. And there was a refueling point just for those passenger trains. And you couldn't bring the train to the filling station, so to speak. So the rail yard had to bring the fuel and the water and the sand to where the train stopped ordinarily. And so there was a bunch of spots all over the yard that had this plumbing and piping and so forth to get the trains filled up. Now, they could run 500 or 600 miles on fuel, number 6 bunker oil, but they could only run about 250 to 300 on the water. And it was very critical that they didn't run out of water, because if they ran out of the water, that meant the train had to go into the roundhouse. You would blow the plugs at the bottom, and that had required replacing the plugs and sometimes the whole boiler tank. And so there were 8 tracks, I think, in the roundhouse, and each could handle 2 cars, so they could work at 16 at a time. So very big operation, went on for many years, employed lots of people in Lafayette, and was a major factor in the economy of Lafayette and making Lafayette grow.
I've been impressed at what a big part of our history it is, and how much that history is just lost today. Other communities have kept
Yeah.
some information about this sort of thing in their local museums, but I really haven't seen the history of the rail yard and railroad work being documented here in Lafayette.
There's very little, looking for it, there's very little to be found. Even good photographs are minimal, and It's amazing, as big as it was a part of Lafayette's economy, that we didn't know more of, didn't have more of a historical recordation. How many people worked there? How many trains did they support? And one of the biggest rail lines in the country was between Houston, Galveston, and New Orleans. That was connecting two major shipping ports, and all the stuff that came down the Mississippi could get on a rail and go into Houston and, move into ships going around the world, Houston and Galveston. So, very important part of our economy. And of course, the rail yard advanced Lafayette. We I think worked out a deal with the railroad to build a power plant that would not only power up Lafayette, but the rail yard itself, and that was the Grant Street power plant, which is another big environmental problem beyond the rail yard. The Grant Street power plant operated from 1897 to 1953, and it used the same boiling process as the trains, the same fuel, and it was 103 megawatts, which was an enormous amount of power for a little community of Lafayette in 1897. Probably had 3,000 or 4,000 people in it, maybe 5. And so let's see if we can take this call. You on the air? Can we help you?
Oh, yes. I'm trying to reach Ecologic.
You got it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hey, Roger, come in, world. We here.
Yeah. I tuned in a little late. I wanted to ask Dr. Waldon something. I might have missed this. What is Dr. Waldon's background?
We're keeping it secret.
I'm sorry?
He worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife here in Lafayette for many years.
Yes,
Yeah.
I worked for 12 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. My major focus was on the Everglades, although I spent part of my years working here out of the Lafayette office. Before that, I was a professor at University of Louisiana here in Lafayette, and before that, I was a professor at LSU in environmental science. And I used to be a professional engineer, licensed professional engineer in environmental engineering. I didn't keep my license after I retired, so I'm no longer a licensed engineer. For the federal government, I was called a hydrologist.
Okay, I see. I wanted to ask you if you could comment on the what I've been hearing with the connector project about the cut and cover plan, and what is your take on that, if you don't mind? Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got really great hesitation about the cut and cover plan. As we were discussing the rail yard, the cut and cover plan would go through the length of the rail yard, digging a wide swath, about 12 feet deep, I believe, and the width of a 4-lane interstate, 6-lane interstate, and whatever other lanes you need to have the entrance and exit ramps that would widen it even more. And that's all going through contaminated soil. The actual levels of contamination aren't really characterized because the studies haven't been done, or at least aren't available to tell us exactly what's there. But we know from rail yards that there are some really problematic materials there. There's from the tracks, from the railroad ties, there's arsenic, almost certainly present. There is all over the country where there were old railroads. The arsenic was used to treat the wood, and it was also used as an insecticide back in the days before we had DDT. So there's very high levels of arsenic in most rail yards. Here in our rail yard, there's probably high levels of asbestos because asbestos was used as the insulation around the boilers.
Yeah, well, and a firebox.
Yeah, okay. So, because this was a major place for repairing the engines, a lot of that asbestos almost certainly was disposed of here. Back before the 1940s, even the 1950s, it wasn't as well known what a massive problem asbestos is. You know, in World War II, we had ships that had a lot of asbestos in them to fireproof them, and that was good. It worked well as a fireproofing, but the workers who worked with asbestos were very badly affected, and asbestos is an unusual toxic material, carcinogen, because there's no known limit to the amount of exposure that will cause you to get cancer and asbestosis. So exposure to asbestos is a really big problem. So as we go...
There's no acceptable level of exposure.
That's exactly the way to say it.
Yes.
So as we go digging out here, asbestos really isn't a danger when it's just buried in the ground. It's basically
You
a
drill
rock.
into it.
Yeah, but if you dig it up, there's almost certainly going to be dust, and that dust is going to contain asbestos. So all this excavation is going to have to be done with a major dust control component. There will have to be air monitoring. It's very likely that everybody that works on the excavation project would have to have what's called hazmat training. They will almost certainly all have to wear hazmat suits, you know, what sometimes people call moon suits. They'll probably have to, all the workers will have to have respirators that filter out the dust. And that's what we'll be looking at right here from AOC, looking across at these people doing this.
And it'll only
this
take 12
excavation.
years to do this, so
Yes, then all the equipment that's working there in that contaminated area will have to be washed before it leaves the site. After you wash it, you have to collect all the water from the wash water, because that's a hazardous material, and that wash water will have to be disposed of as a hazardous material. The drainage that comes out of this contaminated area almost certainly will all have to be collected after any rainstorm. We'll have to have a pond somewhere that can collect the entire volume of a rainstorm of water coming off the area. Then that water will have to be treated or disposed of. Perhaps we could put in a deep well here and deep well inject the water slowly over time out of the pond, or you could load it onto rail cars and take it somewhere
Morgan City.
and let them deep well inject it. All the waste materials that are carried away, that the excavated soil will have to be disposed of as hazardous waste. That, at its cheapest, I've looked on the internet trying to find price lists for disposing of hazardous soil. The cheapest is down around $100 if the contamination isn't too bad.
$100 per ton.
$100 per cubic yard.
Oh, okay.
And it goes up over $1,000 per cubic yard if
Saturated soils. The estimate we had from the Morgan City landfill was $950 for fuel saturated soil, which they handled from all over the country. These filling stations that had fiberglass tanks that they punched holes through because they were thick as a stick, 10 feet long, down it every day. You punch a hole in the bottom. And of course, the fuel leaked into the soils. They removed the tank and all the fuels. And there's only a couple of places in the country that was taking that. And that was, one of them was here in Louisiana at Morgan City, Bateman Island.
So basically, if you figure out how many cubic yards of material they're going to have to remove to do the cut and cover, it's going to be incredibly expensive to excavate that as hazardous material.
And they can't
dispose of
use
it as
that
hazardous
material
waste.
to put as a cover.
Exactly, they'll have to bring in fresh,
Fresh, clean.
fill that they get from somewhere to use. So it's, I just question whether there's any economic or environmental feasibility to doing the cut and cover option. Other problem with cut and cover is that it gives you even less hydraulic gradient to get the roadway to drain. And of course, hurricane evacuation is one of our big reasons for building this. If the roadway won't drain when you've got a really hard rainstorm, the value of the roadway as for hurricane evacuation is zero. And if beyond that, you've also degraded the local streets, as is in the plan to degrade things like Evangeline so that it can't carry as much traffic, we'll have a much worse rather than a better situation for hurricane evacuation. So my answer is I'm very skeptical about cut and cover.
Then you have the issue of hazardous materials, gasoline, butane, diesel fuel, liquid chlorine, a lot of bad stuff moving on those trucks. And they really shouldn't go through a tunnel.
Oh, no, if you enter most cities like
Mobile.
coming back from Florida, going into the tunnel there at Mobile, the sign says hazardous cargo, take this exit.
Yeah.
So it's likely that we will have to not allow hazardous cargo to go on that cut and cover roadway.
Maybe we
I
could
don't
run
know
them on
where we're gonna
Ambassador.
do it.
We could run them on Ambassador.
Yeah, the
Maybe
hazardous
run,
cargo
yeah.
will have to go on Ambassador, on the degraded Evangeline Thruway.
Yeah.
That's a very serious problem.
And then they want to move the project over 150 feet to the east, which will reduce the grade to a point that they think is acceptable. That's a 6% grade. All our interstate highway grades are 3%. So it's going to be a steep grade heading to the railroad track. And on a rainy, slippery day, I think that's inviting disaster.
Yeah, and particularly at interstate speeds.
Yes,
Like,
right, yeah.
People will be moving. I've heard some people say, well, all that hazardous cargo goes through Lafayette right now, but it goes through Lafayette at 35 miles an hour.
That's right.
When it's moving at 70 and other people are going 80, that's quite a difference when you have an accident.
Yeah, and then there's no backing out, there's no going forward, and the
Right.
tunnel traps all the fumes and everything in it.
Yes.
Not to mention the rain problem. So, and that whole concept is an entirely new design, which, when this issue went to federal court in '04, the defense, we claimed the alternatives were insufficient to meet the alternative requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act. The argument was made by the lawyers for DOTD that the 6 alternatives in the environmental impact study were the only alternatives that met the need of safety and transportation. So this whole tunnel idea is something completely new, not in the concept of the original 6 at all. Seems like they have abandoned the RR4 that we have a $59 million contract to implement. So it's going to be interesting to see where all it goes. You on there? Can we help you?
Yes, I heard you talk about the hazardous materials that would be dug up over on the railroad site and taking care of the workers out there and their hazmat outfits. What about all the people that are downtown? What about all of the people that live in Macomb Vise or Freetown? What will they do for protection? It gets in air conditioning units and goes on and on, or does it not go that far?
Well, absolutely, it depends on the wind, and Dr. Mike can help with this. But how do you deal with Festival International or Mardi Gras? where you have people lined up by the zillions along the streets, and in those yards, thousands of cars were parked in that rail yard for Festival International. It's the wonder they didn't blow one of them up. So, Mike, your comment on that?
Well, yes, dust from the asbestos, also arsenic, lead, materials that you certainly would expect to be in a rail yard are almost certainly there because it was a heavily used rail yard. All these things are going to blow in the dust.
VOCs, PCBs, trichloroethylene, and a long, long list of contaminants that are there, all of which, when you start stirring up the soil, you're going to invite this to go into the atmosphere.
So there's usually, for a project like this, you would have a dust control program, and everywhere you were digging, there would probably be a water spray that's spraying water to try to keep any dust from going off site. And a site like this also would have to have a air quality monitoring program that monitored the air quality all around the circumference of the site. Still, you know, you get an unexpected big windstorm, a big convection gust of wind coming through.
Like a hurricane for 3 or 4 days?
Yeah. You know, with the loose soil there, keeping it from getting airborne and blowing the dust all into all the neighboring areas and into downtown would be a challenge. I don't know if they can do it.
All right, another question I have is, you know, in all the charrettes, they only go from 2nd and 3rd Street to maybe Pinhook. We don't see the airport. We don't see Willow. And all of the stuff that's going to be happening at those 2 points and how that's going to affect, but especially the airport. I understand that at one point the east-west runway was going to need to be moved 150 to 350, maybe even more feet into our Cypress Island swamp. What kind of impact is that going to be? And I'm going to hang up and listen to your answer.
Thank you for the call.
Thanks.
We were talking about that earlier, just the physics of the site. The swamp floor is at 8-foot elevation. The runway, which will have to stay level, is at 48 feet. So you got a 40-foot hill there. The hill that you see, the Henderson Levee, looks rather large. That's only about 19, 20 feet above grade. This is twice the height. So it's going to be really sticking out in that swamp, and the cost of doing it is phenomenal. But the environmental risks are certainly there, affecting the bowl that essentially stores Lafayette flood water. That's going to be interrupted and changed. That's going to be done with, and Mike's the hydrologist. He can share with us how changing that bayou and changing the sheet flow in that swamp drastically could raise water levels in Lafayette that should be thoroughly and completely investigated. So, Mike, you might talk about that?
Yeah, well, you're certainly going to lose storage in the swamp when you fill it with many feet of fill. Also, just the feasibility of doing that is questionable. Already, it tells us in the EIS that the airport attempted to extend the runway 200 feet, and they had so much subsidence problems that they abandoned that extension. So now they'll have to go back, and instead of doing the 200-foot extension, the EIS says I'll have to do a 350-foot extension. I've tried to redo the calculations. This is another of my disappointments in the quality of the EIS. I would have hoped that they would have shown their calculations and shown what data they used to get that 350-foot value. They repeat it multiple times throughout the EIS, but they never tell you how they calculated it. When I've tried to go back to the FAA guidance and do the calculation myself, I get a much bigger value. And so I believe that instead of 5 acres, they're gonna have well more than 35 acres, maybe 50 acres. It depends on how long the embankment has to be that goes down the sides of this huge amount of fill that they've got to put in. And also,
The
there's
gradient of
gonna
the-
be problems with subsidence on the end of the runway. This is swampland you're building on.
Yeah, how do you
It-
stack
it-
40
it
feet?
consolidates.
How do you stack 40 feet of material on low-density organic soil? It just doesn't stack very well, unless you go out and dredge it out and go to the hard pan clay, which might be 20 or 30 feet down. Now you got a field that's 60 or 70 feet, which all has to be compacted. It can't, the strongest part of the runway is the first third on each side, depending on which way you're landing. That's where your concrete is something like 3 times thicker than the middle, because that's taking the impact of a landing aircraft that weighs jillions of pounds. So you're putting all that load on the swamp. When we got it up on the hill, it's fine. But put it in the swamp, that's a big question mark, and just an enormous engineering challenge to do correctly. And failing to do it correctly, you compromise an aircraft safety.
Yes, and at the other end of the runway, the idea of building tall structures on the periphery of your airport just is a bad idea.
Yeah.
Right, even though you can say, well, we'll move the runway back so we meet minimum federal safety requirements, still you're just meeting the minimum federal safety requirements.
You on the air? Can we help you? Hello, you on the air?
Hello, good afternoon, gentlemen. I appreciate y'all taking the time here today, and I know today's comments are really on the connector and environmental issues that we're faced with here in Lafayette with that, but we also need to look at the impact that it will have not only for Lafayette but the surrounding parishes as well as the state and the rest of the country once we figure out where it actually needs to go, which the EIS has determined that, and other things. Doctor, you understand that about the impact of what it might do with the contamination. But with that being said, we need to look at y'all mentioned it earlier about the evacuation for the whole state coming from the south, New Orleans, our friends down there, about what a highway can do. Many people remember sitting in traffic for hours or even days coming through Lafayette, but that's one for for evacuation, the economic impact that will have on this area as well as the entire state. So those are some of the positive things that we have to. And the good thing about today is that we have all the things that y'all are addressing about environmental contamination, other things that are positive, that we can affect those things. So I'm going to hang up and listen, but I just wanted to make that comment of what this will do for our state as far as bringing good things, moving people, moving goods and services throughout the state. And I thank you for your time.
You bring a very valid point up, and that is that this issue goes far beyond Lafayette. It's the people who use it in commerce every day, people who are going to get out of harm's way because of hurricanes, and that includes the 19,000 people who work offshore, who all come ashore when a hurricane hits the Gulf. They all land on shore, and they're stuck on this highway. And it took like 10 hours to go from Franklin to Lafayette. And so your point is so valid that it's far beyond the neighborhoods of Lafayette. It affects all of South Louisiana. It has an effect on the entire state and the people who would want to use these roads just to travel, to engage in commerce, and to get out of harm's way during a hurricane or storm. Am I?
Yes, that's very important. It's going to be important during construction too. That's a big reason that I support building one of the two bypasses, or maybe both bypasses around Lafayette. The first, if we go through Lafayette on an elevated roadway through Lafayette, I'm just afraid that's not really a very resilient way to make a design. All it's going to take is somebody running out of gas during the hurricane evacuation up on top of that bridge, and you're going to lose a lane, at least one lane.
Yeah.
And if somebody rear ends the next guy ahead of them because that guy has stopped, run out of gas, you maybe are going to lose 2 of your lanes.
And you only have 3 to move the traffic out.
Right, so long bridges just aren't a resilient solution for emergency evacuation. And we see that all the time on the Atchafalaya Bridge. You know, a friend of mine used to commute here to Lafayette from Baton Rouge, and she used to carry her fishing pole with her because she was an avid fisherman, and she always liked to go fishing whenever the traffic stopped on the Atchafalaya Bridge. I don't have great hopes for that elevated roadway being a reliable way to get people out of the south part of the state.
And the big disconnect is people coming from the south, Abbeville, Coastal City, Parker Island, Pecan Island, all those folks really living below Abbeville, Gaydon, and that whole region, Parker Island. They have to come north on 167, and in Lafayette they cross in 90, where all that gang from Franklin and Terrebonne and Plaquemine and Grand Isle, they all heading this way. So you got a crisscross there. I think is one of the major causes of the traffic jam. And I think this tunnel through town doesn't deal with that hardly at all. For 167, they end up wrapping with the cut and cover. They go over the railroad track on Johnson at grade, and then they go over this cover, and they loop all the way almost to Willow Street before they get back on the interstate. And on small roadways, almost like service roads. So that's a major corridor, and addressing how those two, 98 and 167, connect is super important for hurricane evacuation. I don't think they've addressed that very well. So very important that your point of this issue goes far beyond the neighborhoods of Lafayette, and downtown Lafayette is very valid and a very important point.
Yes, and if you look at the proposal for the so-called LRX, the Lafayette Regional Expressway that goes west of Lafayette, it would pick up that traffic that's coming on 167 up out of Abbeville. It would take them up to I-10
Yep.
or further on up to I-49 north of Carencro. It would keep them from mixing with the traffic that's moving around in our city because of the hurricane, and the traffic coming up I-49 already into the area. So
And we would just suspend the toll, right, when the hurricane evacuator comes through?
I would hope that it would be suspended.
Do you
during
really think
hurricanes.
the
That's-
bureaucracy works that well?
Well, I used to live in Florida, and they actually would suspend the tolls during hurricane evacuation there. So I think they would do that here.
Hopefully they would.
And then the Tesh Ridge would be also an excellent option for hurricane evacuation.
You're on air, can we help you?
Harold, Herbie Schilling.
Yeah, good to hear from you, sir.
I was just changing TV, and I saw you on TV and listened to y'all briefly. And I've sat here idly watch what's going on. And I drive through the Vanessa Thruway to work, then back from work, cross it, go down it. And it's an absolute embarrassment to the city of Lafayette, to the Acadiana region. and something absolutely needs to be done. It's an interstate system, and unfortunately, the options are you raise it to, 2 to 3 feet, or you raise it as high as you can. And I understand the concerns of the neighborhood, but I think the wall of the neighborhood would cause a blighted area that would be absolutely irreparable. So therefore, the only option we have is to go up. And the option of remaining as is not an option in my opinion. And I just wanted to speak up because I've sat here way too long and listened to people 25 years trying to stop this project, and it needs to go forward.
No question it needs to go forward because a lot of issues that demand and require it. It's a very important economic issue for the Port of Iberia, for the Port of St. Mary, and, you know, people trying to do business constantly between St. Mary, Iberia, Baton Rouge, all that connection. And the current plan is to go up. That is the RR4 that we have committed $59,115,000 to put in place. That evidently has been stopped. I don't know what's going to happen to the 59 million. And taking its place is not, a choice of 19 other alternatives. And how that will land, we just don't know. But I can assure you that our goal in building, just working out a plan for the Tesh Ridge was to allow this project to happen. And that was a direction of a secretary of DOTD that said, if you want to finish, this is on a boat trip with the Corps of Engineers, a low water inspection. We weren't inspecting much except the ice cream down in the galley. But he made a comment that we need to find a way through or around Lafayette for around 300 to 400 million. If you want to fund it with interstate highway funds. Now, if you want to fund it with state funds and local funds with a toll, you can do anything you want. But if you want to, it has to be built for around 15 to 25 million a mile. And to finish it to New Orleans, about $1 billion available. If you spend $2 billion in Lafayette, it'll never happen. And so the goal of
Harold, you know the government has more money than they know what to do with. And our job is to get our fair share. We've never got our fair share. The economic engine of this community is I-10 and I-49. And if they were properly developed with 6 lanes, frontage roads, we would create jobs that these people never were afforded the opportunity.
Sure. Yep. Right. You're right. And thank you so much for your input, Herbie. Good for hearing from you. Yes, sir.
Okay, Harold.
Thank you. And, you know, for them to abandon the elevated bridge is just I think that's a tribute to the downtown folks that realized this would really be bad to build 4 underpasses. And the history of the underpass is pretty clear. You can go look at the Jefferson underpass, and there's nothing there anymore. That was the most economically viable spot on Jefferson Street, was the railroad track crossing. Now it's, you put an underpass and it's the end of it. And the same with University underpass. And so to build an underpass at Simcoe, a split underpass at 2nd and 3rd, and a new one at Jefferson, and an enormous 2,200-foot underpass at Johnson, Louisiana Avenue, would have enormous economic impact in a negative way for residential properties, for commercial entities, all in the downtown area. And I think that's what's raised the issue of the elevated highway and all the underpasses that were part of it. That is the RR4 plan, and that was approved by your parish council government. It was approved by DOTD, and it's got $59 million to put in place, which apparently has been stopped. But I can't get any verification of that.
Well, I've also I'm very skeptical of how well those underpasses will operate when there's really big rainstorms. And of course, you tend to get really big rainstorms when there are tropical storms and hurricanes coming in and people are evacuating. But if the underpasses fill up and we can't get from one side of town to the other during emergencies, we're going to have problems with our fire department, with ambulances. Most of our hospitals are on the west side,
Yep.
and a lot of our people live on the east side. So there'll be a big problems getting
Real big, and each,
ambulances across our city.
and it gets back to what are you designed for? Are you designed for 10-inch rain in 10 hours? You know, you can think of, there is a number that you use in there. You have an
Yes.
engineering background, and
Yeah,
when
normally you have
when you
what's
go,
called a design storm.
that's it. And when you know, Murphy's Law is always there, and you know, you got an issue of designing, and that design level is if everything works perfect. Now, you get 2 or 3 years of leaves going down those storm drains. It's all gone to the bayou. And you know, the issue of contamination coming in from the sides and cars dropping stuff, all of that, the pump out from those things probably should be a point source discharge. No question it should be. But each of these tunnels must have an independent pumping system and backup generator capacity. Because when the big rains come, off with the hurricane. When does the electricity go off? At the hurricanes.
Yep.
So they have to have backup generators. And so for this project to be married to the railroad is a very expensive marriage. And for it to conflict with the airport. Nobody knows what it's going to cost to deal with this airport. I would dare say we have just committed, City of Lafayette has put a special tax on for 6 months that we contributed $30–40 million to this $90 million new, I guess the new facility, the area where people get in on and off the planes, but this extension out in the swamp is going to be many times that. And who's going to pay for it? You know, I don't think the DOTD is paying for this. I think that's on our nickel.
Our children and grandchildren.
Right, we'll be paying for it, so.
Yeah, another comment I wanted to make about the problems with current commuting on Evangeline. If you think it's bad now, wait till they start doing the construction.
Oh, wow.
That'll be a decade of not being able to go anywhere. Whereas if we built on a bypass, you know, we'll still have the Evangeline Thruway available to us while it's going on and afterwards.
And everybody agrees that it should be improved. And, you know, it's an opportunity for a great boulevard. It's separated by a
Yes.
block. And most of that property has already been acquired by DOTD. So as property becomes available, and I don't think we have to shut down businesses to make this happen, but as it becomes available, crossovers should be shut down. We desperately need to put overpasses, especially on Johnson and Pinhook. You know, those are heavily, crossed, and they are the intersections that really stop, traffic. We got a bunch of useless red lights on the throughway, so there's a bunch of improvements going to be made. Some of them not very expensive, but all this is doable, if the public is willing to get behind it and push a little bit and make it happen. So if you did a bypass, east, west, whatever, the most economical one certainly is the one to the east. That's short, it's all at grade, and it can be built in 2 years. It's not going to interrupt anything. It's not going to kill anybody's business. This current project will take 1,200 jobs. So we're at the end of our program. So thank you so much, Mike, for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And it's a real honor to be on your show.
Great. Thank you, sir. Think we got it? Yes, sir.